Good morning and welcome to the second day of this virtual symposium, Mythical Pasts, Fantasy Futures, the Middle Ages and Modern Visual Culture. My name is Dr. Sarah Schaefer, and I'm an assistant professor of art history at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and co-curator of J.R.R. Tolkien, The Art of the Manuscript, which is currently on view at the Haggerty Museum of Art at Marquette University here in Milwaukee. I am one of the co-organizers of the symposium, along with Dr. Larissa Grolemond, who co-curated the Getty's blockbuster exhibition, The Fantasy of the Middle Ages, which will unfortunately be closing this weekend. I'll just make a quick note here about the fact that this session or these panels today are being recorded, and closed captioning has been turned on, so you can deal with this in your own situation how you'd like. The chat function is open, so please feel free to use that resource for sharing links and information and so forth. And we encourage you to also use the question and answer function to address questions to our presenters over the course of the day. We've got a really exciting lineup of presentations throughout the day, and we're looking forward to having you all engage with our speakers through these various means, through the Q&A and chat functions. Before convening our first panel, though, Larissa and I wanted to take a few minutes to give an overview of the symposium and the exhibitions that prompted its organization. It didn't take long after meeting Larissa a couple of years back to recognize a kindred spirit in her, and not only in our collective appreciation for fantasy and medievalisms, but in our shared recognition of the potential that museum spaces offer for engagement with these materials. I think I can confidently say that a motivating factor for the exhibition, The Fantasy of the Middle Ages, as well as J.R.R. Tolkien, The Art of the Manuscript, was to create forums of exploration for various fan communities, to engage new and emerging points of entry, and to articulate the stakes of these dialogues between past and present, real or imagined. With J.R.R. Tolkien, The Art of the Manuscript, my co-curator, William Fliss, who's the Tolkien archivist at Marquette University's Rainer Memorial Libraries in Milwaukee, Bill and I were following in the wake of several ambitious and highly successful Tolkien exhibitions. Tolkien, Maker of Middle-earth, mounted at the Bodleian Libraries at Oxford and the Morgan Library and Museum in New York, and Tolkien, Journey to Middle-earth at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, brought Tolkien's life, writings, and artwork to the viewing public in comprehensive ways, and both were accompanied by robust illustrated catalogs. Our aim with our exhibition was never to approximate these other exhibitions, but rather to establish a particular lens that could yield new questions and insights. What we came to was the idea of the manuscript, both as simply a handwritten document or book, and as a draft version of an unpublished work. This concept allowed us to think through how manuscripts functioned in Tolkien's working process, both as a scholar of medieval languages and literature, and as a creative author and artist responsible for an unprecedentedly comprehensive legendarium. Tolkien studied medieval manuscripts, usually in the form of scholarly facsimiles, and the impact of this work is most evident in the group of objects that are in many ways at the heart of the exhibition. Tolkien's draft and completed versions of 3 facsimile pages for the Book of Mazarbul, the dwarf chronicle that the Fellowship of the Ring find in the mines of Moria. Here we see the influence or the confluence of Tolkien's deep knowledge of manuscript traditions and adaptations of that knowledge in the context of his world building. The earliest draft of 1 page is on the verso of a sheet of paper with the first version of Balin's tomb inscription. So if you see that image down there at the bottom, the first version of this draft page is actually on the flip side, and we are able to show that other side. You just have to walk around from this viewpoint that you're getting in the image on the bottom. Subsequent drafts, including the one that's on the upper portion here, show the previously fragmented page reconstituted, and its final version, which is unfortunately off screen here, the final version is enhanced, as we do see in these draft iterations, by red washes and burn marks made with the author's pipe. For us, the Book of Mazarbul drafts and finished facsimiles alone opened up a host of productive questions, not just about Tolkien's craft as an artist, as a conlanger, that is a constructor of new languages, and I just learned this term from my co-curator, Bill Fliss. And here we see two of his different constructed script forms actually at play, the Kiernic Ruth and the Tengwar, and a storyteller. So we see these different elements of his creative production coming together, but also the way that medieval visual and material culture was made available to a scholar like Tolkien and to the broader public in the 19th and 20th centuries, and still through to today. Tolkien was born in 1892 at a time when photomechanical processes were generating increasing access to medieval manuscripts. When Tolkien began his career as a professor of Anglo-Saxon, that is Old English, at Oxford in the early 1920s, the Early English Text Society's facsimile of the Beowulf manuscript, which was nearly destroyed in a 1731 fire, was a key resource. It is unlikely that Tolkien ever saw the original manuscript at the British Library, where it is still held today. Tolkien's facsimile pages of the Book of Mazarbul, which he had hoped would be included in the published Lord of the Rings, are in many ways the product of a scholar who was deeply engaged not only with literary and oral traditions, but also with how these traditions are transmitted visually and materially. This is a thread that continues through to the present and something that we explore in the final gallery of the exhibition, which highlights the history of the Tolkien archive at Marquette. Visitors have the opportunity to view portions of Tolkien's manuscripts on microfilm, the manner in which all researchers have had to view these objects since the originals were retired in the 1980s. And get a preview of the new digital system called Anduin, the creation of which my co-curator Bill Fliss has shepherded for years. And I'll just note as a side note, if you're not able to make it out to the exhibition, we have the entire catalog reproduced in the exhibition checklist, which is available on through the Haggerty's website, the Haggerty Museum of Art, which is where this is mounted. Tolkien is often credited as the father of modern fantasy literature or high fantasy, and this moniker is valid given the breadth of art, adaptations, and fan fictions of which he is the progenitor. But the growth of fantasy culture in recent decades has demonstrated not only Tolkien's central position, but also the limitations of his secondary world and the opportunities for further creative exploration. And with that in mind, I'm going to turn things over to Larissa, who's going to talk a bit about the Fantasy of the Middle Ages exhibition.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's so amazing to get a preview of the Haggerty's show and the kind of wonderful intersections of Tolkien's interest in the medieval and in manuscripts specifically. I will share a little bit this morning about the Fantasy of the Middle Ages at the Getty Museum, which unfortunately closes this Sunday, so you have a few more days to see it. But this has been a really interesting and generative project to work on. So I co-curated this exhibition with Brian Keene, a former associate curator of manuscripts at the Getty and now at Riverside City College. And this really was born out of conversations that we had with our audiences. This began as a social media initiative where we were recapping episodes of Game of Thrones with images from our collection. We got so much interest and feedback from the audience that we thought, why not turn this into an exhibition? And we really wanted to take a very broad look at the ways in which the Middle Ages has been reimagined and reconstructed over the course of many centuries, really since the period itself. And so we have about 7 centuries of material represented in the show. The earliest object is a 14th century Tales of Sir Tristan manuscript from the Getty's collection. And I think the most recent object is either the Sword in the Stone prop book or the Andy Warhol index book from the 1960s. So we really have a huge range of different approaches to reconstructing the Middle Ages represented in the show. And this felt really important to us because the vision of the Middle Ages that we have today is still very much under construction and still so much a part of our everyday pop culture. And so we really wanted to look broadly at not just the book arts, but also include objects of other media, including photography. There's a few prints, paintings, and even kind of considering reenactment and the idea of the live action Middle Ages in film and in television. So the show begins with a consideration of the medieval imagination and the centrality of the combination of history and myth to medieval storytelling, really from the earliest days. And so we chose this pairing, which is a 15th century book of hours from our collection, which really encapsulates what we thought was the stereotypical view of the Middle Ages, the knight in shining armor on a steed, rescuing a princess from a dragon with a castle in the background. And we really wanted to look at how the art of the Middle Ages was the foundational visual impetus for later iterations, including things like William Morris's Kelmscott Press, which takes the idea of these inscribed gender roles and represents them for a new audience in the 19th century, particularly interested in the revival of medieval ideals. And what we found really fascinating was the way that the aesthetics of the medieval book were adapted and reused over so many centuries, but remain very recognizable as a quote unquote medieval approach to designing the page and designing the book. So this is something you'll see in a lot of the objects throughout the show. One of the main topics that we wanted to discuss was the intersection of magic and the Middle Ages, and how it is that the Middle Ages becomes a comfortable and flexible period for magical creatures, for fairy tales, for happenings that are supernatural or even paranormal, and that this was really a primarily visual process, that there's nothing in fairy tales particularly as they come to be geared toward children and young audiences in the 19th century. There's nothing in them that particularly sets them in the Middle Ages, but that this was the work of illustrators. And the idea of the Middle Ages as a place of ruined stone castles and enchanted forests and magical creatures like fairies and witches, which don't have a central place in the visual culture of the Middle Ages, are read back into the period through their inclusion in fairy tales. And we found this kind of visual construction of the period and its additive elements really fascinating. We, of course, have a section on King Arthur and Camelot, and particularly involving the idea of Victoriana in the 19th century, and the introduction of new media like photography to the existing kind of corpus of book arts that was invested in representing the Arthur story for new audiences, but using the aesthetics of the medieval book in new 19th and early 20th century modes. As Sarah said, this kind of introduction of chromolithography and printing really helps bring these stories to a huge new audience. And the idea of Arthur as kind of a romantic story, which is constantly under construction, really since the Middle Ages and going all the way up to really today, and still continues today in movies especially. We wanted to definitely include medieval times and the Renaissance Fair, and the idea of the medieval period as an eminently reenactable period. That's something that we still want to see in live action. And of course, jousting was a part of the culture of the Middle Ages, but by the 15th and 16th century, largely spectacle and entertainment, but an important component of aristocratic identity. And jousting is something that is still very much a part, I think, of our conception of the Middle Ages today, in which we still want to see in live action. And there are a whole host of people in the modern day who are practitioners of the art of jousting. And it's something that's still very much alive in the psyche, I think, of our conception of the Middle Ages. And we also have Andy Warhol's index book, which uses the visual language of medieval siege warfare, this idea of the stereotype of the Middle Ages as a place of constant disease and war, to make a commentary on his circle's position in the art world in the 1960s. We also touch on the cinematic Middle Ages and the idea of costume design and art design for medieval movies, both live action and animated. So thinking about the ways that the visual language of the Middle Ages has been simplified and codified over time so that we really only need a few visual cues to know that we're in the medieval period. We need a swooping sleeve, we need a cape, we need a brocade, we need, flapping banners in the wind and a cohort of aristocratic people in elaborate costumes on horses heading up to a castle. So these wonderful costume sketches for Hollywood blockbusters in the 30s through the 50s, as well as, of course, the huge impact that Disney had on the conception of the Middle Ages through their representation of the stories in animated form, especially Disney's Sleeping Beauty of 1959. And then finally, we wanted to have a place in the exhibition which acknowledged the ongoing construction of the Middle Ages in pop culture, really through collectibles and objects which are not normally considered objects of fine art. I'll put that in quotes. This is a very kind of un-Getty approach to the presentation of this material, but I was really happy to have it in the exhibition because I think it does really go a long way towards showing how pervasive the idea of the Middle Ages is. Not just in movies and film, but also in things like tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, like Magic the Gathering, which you'll hear more about today, but in comic books, in toys, in books, in movies, in all of these different things, which we don't, I think, normally think of as a group necessarily, but we really wanted to show them in a continuum with the objects of quote unquote fine art in the rest of the show. And I think they live really happily with these objects. So they're displayed in this atrium space between the two galleries of the show. And they've been really a gathering place for community discussions of this material. And I think have been such an important impetus for bringing people into the show. And something that I think is really particular about this material is that people come to it already with a lot of knowledge. And there are so many fandoms and sort of fan communities who know a lot more about this material than we do, especially things like Dungeons and Dragons, which we are of course aware of, but have not been practitioners of ourselves. And it's been really fascinating, I think, to watch people look at this material and say, well, I have that thing in my attic, or I am a huge fan of this Harry Potter stuff, or this Lord of the Rings stuff, or whatever it is. And I think that has been a really particular aspect of this show. People have been able to see themselves in it in a way that maybe is not always possible with traditional museum presentations. And so I think part of the impetus for putting this symposium together was to really think about the impact of the Middle Ages on pop culture, especially, but the ways in which that kind of expands the bounds of fine art, and it kind of opens up our view of what's possible in a museum presentation of this material, especially, and hopefully encourages people to kind of rethink their relationship with the Middle Ages, and maybe could have an influence on the way that the period is perceived more broadly. So with that, I will hand it back to Sarah. And I hope that many of these themes kind of come out throughout the course of the day. And please, I encourage you to use the chat to chat with fellow participants and other audience members. And I'm really looking forward to an exciting day of presentation. So Sarah, I hand it back to you.
I just have to say, I love that image of the ring being mounted. And I think there are so many opportunities for points of intervention with that. We think of the ring, the ring of power is this singularly powerful object. And the fact that it's a replica of the ring that's getting that kind of attention in that presentation, in that photograph is so great. And I'll also just say I had a chance to see the exhibition, and it is so smart and fun. And if you have an opportunity to see it this weekend, definitely go and check it out. But there is also this great book that accompanied it that will live on. So I'll just wrap up this introductory set of remarks by saying a little bit more about the symposium, just kind of echoing some of the points that Larissa just made. So many academic disciplines have embraced the popular cultures of fantasy, science fiction, comics, gaming, cosplay, and so forth. And while art history and museum studies are not precluded from this trend, there are factors unique to our fields that have undoubtedly somewhat stymied these developments. And these are things that were actually touched on a little bit in the keynote panel that occurred last night. So once that video is up online, I encourage you to check it out if you weren't able to attend last night. So part of this kind of limited scope within the fields of art history and museum studies has to do with deep institutional and disciplinary histories that have long determined what kind of art is and it's not appropriate for academic study or curatorial intervention. But I don't want to center that factor here. While art history must continue to reflect on the prejudicial histories that have long defined its boundaries, I, for one, am really invigorated by the rigorous efforts I've seen at exploding the canon, even in just the past few years. And certainly this exhibition, Larissa and Brian's exhibition, is a great example of that. But what I want to underscore rather is just the kind of the size of our field in comparison to, say, literary studies or modern history. This is somewhat of an asymmetrical comparison, but I did yesterday just a brief survey of the top peer-reviewed journals dedicated to Tolkien and kind of related mythopoeic literature, and found 23 peer-reviewed articles on Tolkien in 2020, and that was just through like 3 or 4 journals. You'd be hard-pressed to find an equivalent amount of scholarship produced even in the broadest subfield of art history in a given year. And again, it ultimately comes down to the relative size of our field. If an institution of higher education has an art history department, it is almost inevitably dwarfed by its English or history counterparts. Now, I bring this up not to polemicize, but rather to foreground one of our aims for this symposium, which is to center the analysis of the visual and material in medievalizing fantasy culture. Our panels today feature individuals with diverse scholarly backgrounds and interests, not just art historians or museum curators, united here in a fundamental recognition of the value of close looking, whether of an academic painting, an invented heraldic emblem, a pulp novel cover, or any of the other examples explored throughout the day. And these open, expansive, and cross-disciplinary discussions made possible, we have to highlight, through the support of the Getty and the Haggerty Museum of Art. We hope that this will provide a model for continuing conversations and future efforts. So that will conclude our introductory remarks. We've got a few minutes now before the first panel convenes at 9:30. So please stick with us and we'll be back on in a few minutes.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the first panel of today's program. This is the stuff of fantasy, which I'm really excited about. We have 3 speakers this morning, and they will each present their papers, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So if you have a question for any of our speakers, you can pop that into the Q&A box, and we will have a discussion toward the end of the panel. And please look out in the chat for speaker bios, as well as links and other resources related to their talks. So I will go ahead and introduce our first speaker, Ali Alvis, who will be presenting on the idea of the medieval book in Magic: The Gathering. Ali, go right ahead.
All right. Happy to be the first presenter today, and thank you again to the Getty for making this all possible. This is such an exciting way to look at the Middle Ages and medievalism. So with that said, The trading card game Magic the Gathering boasts over 40 million players, over 22,000 unique cards, a multiverse of locations, and a deep well of lore. Although it features many fantastic settings, Magic does not exist in a vacuum. It draws from a bevy of real-world objects and media to create worlds that feel both new and, at the same time, accessibly familiar. One item that features heavily in the lore, mechanics, and aesthetics of Magic is the book. Books permeate the many planes of Magic in both a visual and functional sense. Cursed tomes, libraries, and book-devouring monsters are common features of card art and accompanying stories. And on a meta level, the cards themselves are meant to represent books. Magic's different planes are soundly situated in the broad category of fantasy, which owes a huge aesthetic debt to Western medieval period. But they owe perhaps an even greater debt to medievalism, a relationship brilliantly expounded upon by Megan L. Cook in her article Dirtbag Medievalism. Dirtbag is a somewhat affectionate epithet in the sense of Wheatus's song Teenage Dirtbag. Cook says a dirtbag is certainly not the best thing one could be, but it's probably not the worst either. The art and story of Magic is a prime example of dirtbag medievalism, which Cook describes as an earnest, bombastic, quote, kind of meta-medievalism distilled through the internet and pop culture, end quote, more concerned with the idea of the medieval than historical accuracy or authenticity. Enter the medieval-ish book. Codices with physical aspects associated with medieval books serve as efficient visual shorthand to establish environment and atmosphere when they appear in card art, and also contribute to the construction of a sort of manufactured cultural nostalgia that is meant to immerse a player. True realism is not what the game designers and artists are trying to achieve in their use of books as set pieces, or really even in the form of the books themselves. Thus, by examining the aesthetics and function of books in fantasy pop culture properties like Magic the Gathering, we can begin to establish a framework for a dirtbag book history. In order to get a sense of the context in which the books of Magic appear, I will first give a brief overview of the game's history and rules. I will then delve into the format and symbolic weight of books in Magic and explore how the game designers and artists use the idea of a medieval book to establish a fantasy setting. Magic the Gathering, which I will also refer to as simply Magic, was created by American mathematician Richard Garfield and is published by games company Wizards of the Coast. The first set of Magic cards was released in August 1993. Today, new sets are released quarterly, with a new one that just came out today, and are based on overarching narratives, a topic I will return to shortly. The basic concept of the gameplay of Magic is that players are planeswalkers, magical beings that can move between different planes of reality, and they are engaging in a wizardly duel by casting spells and summoning creatures. The cards represent these creatures and spells, as well as the magical energy needed to cast them. To win, a player must get their opponent's life total to 0 by attacking them with creatures and spells. All Magic cards display the same layout: card name at the top, followed by an image, then the card's type, and finally the card's text, which describes how the card is used and its effects. Sometimes there will also be italicized flavor text, which I will describe in more detail shortly. In Magic terminology, a player's deck of cards is called a library. The idea is that all of the creatures a player can summon and spells they can cast are contained in a, quote, magical tome, as Magic's head designer Mark Rosewater calls it. Another method of winning the game is by making your opponent draw all of their cards, thus depleting their library and making them unable to draw any more magical knowledge from it. This concept is reflected in the design for the backs of the cards, one of which you can see here. It loosely resembles a mottled calf binding with a central panel, a la the early 18th century Cambridge style. The book form was further reinforced in the packaging of the earliest starter decks, whose boxes featured page edges and even a bookmark. I ran a census of Magic cards containing images of books in late 2021, which yielded interesting results. By using these keywords to search the names of the cards in the Scryfall and Gatherer databases, I turned up approximately 100 cards with bibliographic content out of around 22,000, which doesn't sound like that many. But this number does not quite paint the whole picture. Many cards feature books in their art without making explicit reference to them in their names. The cultural ubiquity of the book makes it an excellent set piece for establishing an environment or feel. So they're used liberally in the majority of Magic sets, which, as a rule, lean towards the medievalism-heavy fantasy. Within Magic, the setting, lore, and plot are generally called flavor. Some cards even have flavor text, a sentence or two that have nothing to do with gameplay mechanics, but simply add fictional content to the actions performed by the card. Mark Rosewater says, having a good metaphor eases gameplay. If players can apply outside knowledge to implicitly understand game rules, the game's complexity goes down. The flavor text is the only in-game explanation for how the events, objects, and figures depicted in the card art interact with each other in the overarching narrative of the set. And many cards eschew this piece of world building in favor of rules text. Rosewater freely admits that the trading card game format is not the easiest place to tell a story. And this mindset has allowed Wizards of the Coast to focus more on cultivating a game environment with the cards, rather than a full narrative. The bulk of the story elements are found in secondary pieces of media, such as novels, short stories, and comics. It is not necessary to consume these other media in order to enjoy playing the game, but they can add additional layers of meaning and recognition for those players who seek them out. Umberto Eco's statement that we are still living under the banner of medieval technology is true of both the real world and Magic the Gathering. The early medieval rise of the Codex format, thanks to the expansion of Christianity, has had a far-reaching effect on the way Western culture conceptualizes knowledge and the sacred, which is sometimes quite literally interpreted in media. Books being used as visual signals of learnedness is not a new concept. Strolling through any portrait gallery will present you with a host of historical examples of upper classes explicitly using books and libraries as props to communicate the image of an intellectual. Books are more than repositories of text. They are icons of knowledge, notes Jessica Pressman in her 2020 work, Bookishness. In a fantasy setting, gnarled, medieval-appearing books carry the added implication that they are containers of not just knowledge, but magical knowledge. This becomes mechanically relevant in fantasy game settings, which often feature gameplay and visuals structured around spell users being somehow reliant on a book. In Dungeons & Dragons, for example, taking a long rest after a battle recoups a magic wielder's spell slots. It is implied that in this time, the mage is able to not only recharge their magic power, but to review their spellbook. Another Pressman quote, "The book has long been imagined as a prosthetic device that extends human memory. And this concept reaches its zenith in fantasy, specifically the dirtbag variety." In order to get a sense of the intersection of dirtbag medievalism and book history, let's take a deeper dive into one of the many magic cards that feature books, Folio of Fancies from the 2019 Throne of Eldraine set. I spoke to the artist Colin Boyer about his inspiration and the references he used to create the folio, and what kind of guidance or constraints he received from the art directors at Wizards of the Coast. He noted that one of the only strict requirements the art directors had was the inclusion of this keyhole motif. You can see this keyhole repeated on the robes of the wizard Gadwick on another card from the Throne of Eldraine set, Gadwick the Wizened. Folio of Fancies and Gadwick the Wizened are kind of partner cards aesthetically and functionally. In Gadwick's art, we see Gadwick pondering our folio front and center. You can see it with the wings there, while its winged friends flit about in the background. Boyer notes that the working title of Folio of Fancies was actually Grimoire of Gadwick. The keyhole motif on these cards is a clue that Gadwick and Folio play well together mechanically. Boyer cited two broadly defined pieces as aesthetic sources for the page decorations of Folio, quote, an illuminated manuscript and a work by, quote, Leonardo on the fall off of light on cast shadows. The illuminated serpent that appears on the left page is clearly inspired by a medieval bestiary. Given the ubiquity of the images from it, thanks to Aberdeen's digitization and promotional efforts, it seems likely that the bestiary Boyer referenced is the 12th century Aberdeen bestiary, an illumination from it here. Meanwhile, the Da Vinci illustration comes directly from his Paris manuscript C, which was executed in the late 1480s. Boyer's art presents two works that are nearly 400 years apart in history and quite distant geographically, as part of one book, presumably executed by Gadwick or some other individual in fiction. This is dirtbag medievalism being distilled into dirtbag book history. Many magic cards depict the idea of what old books should look like as a delightful mishmash of medieval and early modern characteristics. Even though the idea is passed through a lens of fantasy, it gives us a fascinating glimpse of how the artists and designers of Magic the Gathering conceptualize and leverage the idea of quote-unquote old books. The historicization helps to construct a mythos for the players to inhabit and has also translated to commercial success. Conversations with various artists who worked for Wizards of the Coast on Magic reveal key details about their references to actual extant medieval books. Generally, the artists tend to use Google Images as a starting point, which is not surprising. Different library catalogs can be difficult to navigate even for professionals, say nothing of the numerous proprietary galleries of digitized material that libraries and digital repositories maintain. Common search keywords for the artists include magical tome, which turns up a fascinating array of dirtbag book history material. Heather Hudson, who illustrated the card Geth's Grimoire on the left in 2003, recalls that she created that particular piece in a time before the internet in her professional life. Instead, she used an old Webster's dictionary as the primary visual reference for this girthy tome, which also features nods to the practice of anthropodermic bibliopegy, the binding of a book in human skin. Randy Gallegos, whose art for Tome of the Guild Pact appeared in the 2019 Ravnica Allegiance set, noted that specifically for the wear to the book's spine, he used a book that he has at home, a Spanish language history of Ecuador that is an old family-owned book of his wife's. One pattern that emerged from my conversations with artists is that they couldn't pinpoint their inspiration for certain physical attributes of the old books they painted. They arose from a nebulous general concept of how old books should look. Many books that appear in magic cards feature binding attributes that read as medieval. Chained books are a common sight, with the chains used not only in a traditional sense of being a type of anti-theft device, but in quite whimsical ways, to keep buoyant books from floating away. They can also be used to create a menacing atmosphere. Metal furniture is another binding attribute that is common throughout the planes of magic, taking various familiar and unfamiliar forms. A particularly flexible motif is this central roundel on the front board of codices. This has its source in three places: the aforementioned metal furniture, treasure bindings, and the medievalist 20th century fine bindings by Sangorsky and Sutcliffe. While it is sometimes a metal boss, the roundel most often takes the form of a gemstone, similar to the ones on these treasure bindings from the Walters Museum and the Morgan Library. In an interesting game of bookbinding telephone, some books in card art also show a strong visual relationship to the bindings of Sangorsky and Sutcliffe, who were inspired by treasure bindings. The binding design feature of a central roundel permeates fantasy art, which can clearly be seen in the Google Images result from earlier. This is apparently the Platonic ideal of a fantastic book. The contents of books are less often showcased in card art, but also reveal strong medieval and early modern manuscript inspiration, as we saw in Folio of Fancies. Their pages are usually yellow-hued, either to imply an aged paper or that they're on parchment. There is almost always a focus on the book's illustrations and general layout rather than an effort to convey textual information in the card art. This is for logistical reasons. The small size of the art as it's printed on the cards makes it very difficult for text to be reproduced clearly. This is a dream of the Middle Ages in the parlance of Umberto Eco. At this point in the development of pop culture, however, it's more like we've gone a level deeper into a dream of the Middle Ages, Inception. A classic case of the Baudrillardian substituting the signs of the real for the real, a blurring of reality and representation. We view the books in the card art of magic not only through a lens of knowledge of the historical concept of the medieval, but through a haze of decades of medievalish fantasy blockbusters and bestsellers, AAA video games, and TV shows that are inseparable from the cultural zeitgeist. In the context of magic, books offer players a conduit through which to enter the dream, to affect the medieval fantasy worlds with which they are so familiar, and even to create their own. This is aided by magic's cultivation of a sense of nostalgia and identity. This manufactured nostalgia is generally not at the forefront of promotional campaigns or even as a part of magic's larger narrative, but runs as an undercurrent through many sets. The purposeful depiction of medievalish books and towering bookshelves lures people who believe they yearn for a time when hefty physical books were the norm, when they could stroke the leather and inhale old book smell to their heart's content. The prevalence of books in card art with physical attributes that mark them as medieval works to create the sense that real bookishness was part of the past. The keystone of nostalgia is an awareness of our lack of control in the relentless march of time, and it's difficult to find a better metaphor for this than the contrast between digital and physical books. Even if it is not a conscious criticism of the pervasiveness of technology in the 21st century, by making medieval-ish books such a key object in a fantasy world that is constructed to be an ideal imagined space for players, Magic's writers and designers reinforce the idea that certain cherished associations about books are being challenged in our new media age. Nostalgia for the Western Middle Ages is almost as old as the Middle Ages themselves. Eco notes that Europe was ravaged by a pervasive medieval nostalgia in the earliest to early modern period, seemingly in reaction to a time of scientific, literary, and philosophical progress and change. It is easy to see the parallels here with our own time and why Wizards of the Coast seeks to capitalize on long-established fantasy tropes of a magical past that never existed. Jessica Pressman touches on this idea of an idealized or just plain false history in her discussion of fake books, which aligns with the idea of dirtbag book history. Fakery enables medieval books to be in places where they would not normally be. And it is not separate from the creative, aesthetic, generative, or fun. Maintaining its idea as new by holding in tandem the old, new media acquires the status of the real. This expectation of a degree of fakery grants the artists freedom to be creative with their book designs in order to evoke certain feelings from players. We've already discussed aspects of books in card art that make them appear to be magical, but what about attributes that make them feel used? Gnarled is a common adjective applied to Wizards' spellbooks and other magical tomes. This is both an additional signifier of age and purposely included evidence of use. This wear telegraphs a history of manual manipulation, of opening, turning pages, the crack of the spine, the click of a clasp, close call with a magic fireball, even if this consideration is subconscious for a player. It allows them to imagine these books being used, whether in a mystical library or in the heat of battle. Some artists include hands in the process of manipulating the book, giving players a sense of scale and another point of imaginary entry into the scene. But we must not forget Rosewater's assertion that in practice, Magic's storytelling is secondary to the mechanics of the game. In many ways, card art serves a similar purpose as a miniature in a manuscript book of hours. The primacy is given to the text, the explicit words handed down directly from God or the game designers. But through the image, devotees or players can directly interact with the holy or the game's narrative, creating a deeper personal connection to the source material. Examining the portrayal of medievalish books in Magic the Gathering is just the beginning of a kaleidoscope of opportunities to think critically about how books appear in media through a dirtbag book history lens. As the Getty's Fantasy of the Middle Ages exhibit demonstrates, this is a fruitful area for academic research and an excellent opportunity to engage with people whose main experience with medieval books is through pop culture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellie. It's such an amazing talk and really a great way to get us started. I love the idea of medieval inception, which I think is something we're going to be seeing throughout the day.
Definitely.
Amazing way to start the conference. So thanks so much. Our next speaker is Francesco Bernutzi, who will be talking to us today about heraldry and fan fiction, or fantasy fiction, sorry. Francesco, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. So, heraldry. It is one of the most characteristic and distinctive visual languages of the European Middle Ages. It permeated society, it identified individuals, groups, places, it decorated monuments and art. It is then perfectly understandable that artists creating fantasy world inspired by medieval Europe would want to include heraldry in their settings. But how do they do it? We will try to define some essential characteristics of medieval heraldry, and then we will try to explore two quite different examples from contemporary visual and material culture, pop culture probably, and narrative. Some initial remarks. In my presentation, I will try not to use specific heraldic language, especially when except when necessary. I will sometimes use the words arms in the sense of coat of arms. And finally, I would like to point out that this study owes much to the invaluable work of the French scholar Michel Pastoureau, who, among other things, has statistically analyzed thousands upon thousands of medieval coat of arms. Now, allow me to give an operative definition of heraldry. Most cultures through the ages had developed their own visual codes and systems to identify people and groups. But there are some features that make medieval European heraldry unique. Heraldry was born in the 12th century to make knights recognizable in battle and at tournaments by decorating their shields, clothing, and banners. As such, it consists of at least two elements, two fundamental elements. One is a field of one color, that was basically the shield painted, and then decorations over that field. There are a few essential rules and some conventions. I'm not mentioning them in a prescriptive way to say that fantasy artists today are doing heraldry wrong. We might discuss about that. I am mentioning these rules because they occurred highly frequently. And so if artists today replicate those characteristics, they would really contribute to give a feeling of medieval authenticity. So the first rule deals with colors. Beg your pardon, I don't know if you see the image here. Might be a problem with my presentation, so. Okay, here we are. So medieval heraldry only knows 6 colors originally, and they are more abstract concepts of colors. They are divided in 2 groups. One is metal, and it includes yellow and white, or gold and silver. The other group is properly called colors. It includes red, blue, green, and black. Let us exclude furs because they are not important here for the discussion. So the first, one of the most important rules of heraldry says that when combining a figure on a field, you should never put metal on metal, nor color on color. The reason why you can't have, for example, a red dragon on a black field is simply because those colors don't create a contrast as strong as, for example, red on yellow or black on white. And you can understand why. As we said, heraldry needed to identify, make people identifiable from afar in very confused situations. Surprisingly, medieval heraldry was for everyone, not just nobles. And we already have the consensus of medieval jurists like Bartolo da Sassoferrato. Everybody had the right to bear arms as long as they did not usurp somebody else's arms. So we have arms for commoners, religious groups, communities, places. Unfortunately, our two fantasy examples of today completely disregard this part of heraldry. Finally, bear in mind that when an individual chooses his personal or her personal coat of arms, they then became hereditary. They were used to identify an entire lineage. The next things I mentioned are not exactly rules, simply very common occurrences. The figures in heraldry are not realistic. They are stylized, exaggerated, they tend to fill the space, and if they are living creatures, they tend to face the right, that is, the right of the person bearing the shield. The person will probably have the shield in their left hand, and the animal on it will will look towards the right side. If they are on flags, they usually face the flagpole. One final observation about the figures decorating the coat of arms. They are also known as charges. Please note that, yes, animals and monsters are probably what catches everybody's attention and imagination when we think about medieval heraldry, but animals were as common as simple geometrical decorations or divisions of the fields, images like crosses, bands, even small ornaments called meubles in French, and that there was a good number of plants and objects, some of them of everyday use, that we do not normally associate to the stereotypical image of a knight. Now, for the examples in today's fantasy, examples of heraldry, Warhammer has probably been the most successful fantasy miniature wargame. The miniatures were produced by the British company Citadel and had to be painted by the collectors. So you see, there is already an aspect of personal creativity and active contribution of the collectors to the creation of heraldry. Games Workshop published books to explain the rules of the game, but also to detail the setting and the characters of its fantasy world, and to guide collectors in choosing and painting the miniatures. There was a vast numbers of fantasy nations and armies at war, but we will just focus on the land of Bretonia, that is clearly inspired by 14th century France, as it's evident both from the aesthetic and the naming conventions of places and characters, but it was also inspired by Arthurian legends and the matter of Britain. So we might immediately notice that from these pictures that are in the 1996 edition of the book, that heraldry here really feels authentic. The rule of tincture is always respected, no red on black or yellow on white, and that the animals are facing the right, both on the shields and in flags. Also, while there is actually a preference, as we somehow foresaw, a preference for animals, yet the existence of other forms of purely geometric heraldry or of objects and plants charges is actually taken into account, and it is represented in good proportions. If we focus on animal charges in particular, it is interesting to note the disproportionate preference or monsters in comparison to historical heraldry, where monsters don't go above the 2% of all animals in coat of arms. This is quite to be expected though, because fantasy is the key word here, and people are expecting monsters probably. Also note that other innocuous animals, small birds and fish are completely disregarded and not represented in Bretonian heraldry, while they constituted a good part of historical heraldry, probably because they do not appeal in this warlike setting. The system also seems to work differently in the use of charges. It appears that younger knights use purely geometric shields in Bretonia, and then they only add a figure after completing some worthy deed. While this wasn't the norm, at least historically, it recalls two traditions. One is that of noble families in the Middle Ages justifying their coat of arms by linking it to the heroic deed of some ancestor, usually completely unverifiable. The other tradition is literary. The French term table d'attente, in Italian arme d'aspettazione, let's say waiting arms, indicated the plain monochrome shield carried by young heroes in chivalric romances while they actually waited to accomplish some worthy feat and include it in their arms. By the last edition of the Bretonian book in 2003, the miniatures are a lot more, but to a closer look, heraldry has become definitely poorer. Of all coat of arms, we can say that the coat of arms of all knights boil down to a variation of one of the 14 coat of arms for the duchies of the Kingdom of Bretonia. Of these 14 variations available, almost all are linked to concept of aggressions, and the great majority of those arms represent animals. Half of them are usually monsters. There is sort of an evolution towards a darker heraldry, a more aggressive heraldry, that is understandable probably in the context of the evolution of medieval fantasy from last century to today. Finally, if you note, there are only 5 colors. There is one color less. Green has completely disappeared. All these might have simplified life to the hobbyist, but at the expense of creativity and research, maybe. Finally, in 2015, Games Workshop discontinued its original setting altogether, and Bretonia disappeared with it. They seem like they are working on reviving the old background, but at the moment, this all went away. Our second case study is the extremely popular HBO TV series Game of Thrones, that is based on the novels by George R.R. Martin. In the book and in the show, in the books, pardon, and in the show, heraldry plays a crucial role. It pervades the setting, it is everywhere, and it helps the public identify the huge cast of characters and families fighting each other. A simple shot like this one, with a heraldic flag flying, helps the public of the show immediately identify the place, it sets the scenes, and we know who the characters involved in this scene will be. In addition to this, characters often refers to their house mottos, and also they make comparisons between themselves and the figure that is on their coat of arms or on the family of the coat of arms. So we might say that not only heraldry identifies characters, but also that characters identify with their heraldry and Game of Thrones. If we take a look at the arms of the 9 most important families in the story, well, immediately we have some considerations to make. First of all, colors. Disaster has set in, probably. The rule of tincture is not respected. We have we have red on black, and some colors are introduced that do not exist in medieval heraldry. We have orange here, but in the book there will be even more examples of different hues and shades. Gray, for example, it's not a color in original medieval heraldry. It is the same as white. They are both silver. So the coat of arms of Stark is like literally invisible, actually. It's the same color, both the background and the chart. Yet, of course, this will help the readers of the book, giving visual cues to associate to different families. And if we introduce more shades and different colors, it will facilitate to differentiate between characters. Yet, in the show, it appears that at least for in some cases, the rule of tincture has been amended. In the books, the Bolton family uses a flayed man in red on a pink background scattered with drops of blood. The Mormont family uses a black bear on a green field of pines. In the show, we see that these images have been adapted so that the color charge now rests on a metal background. The contrast is strengthened, and it helps with the readability of the composition. So this actually proved the rule, the original medieval rule, just served an efficient criterion of visibility, and it worked. Another aspect of Game of Thrones heraldry is that it appears to be less fixed than its historical counterpart. In the following images, we see the Lannister Lion on the flags and the shields of the soldiers. Sometimes it is rampant on two legs. Sometimes it is passant on all fours. It's the same colors, the same charge, but a different position. In the Middle Ages, those would be two different coat of arms. In the show, as long as you see the lion, you will recognize the Lannisters. Mind you, there are instances in the show where characters deliberately change their family arms, usually to suit personal intentions, for example, to signify new political allegiances. And that happened in the Middle Ages too. It was actually quite common. Yet, heraldry in Westeros appears to be mutable. The symbol is what seems to matter in the end, not its position, not even its color sometimes. As we said before, the arms serve the purpose of identifying the character, but they also symbolize the personality of the characters. Sometimes they even foreshadow the character's role in the story. So these explain once again the vast preference for animal charges. Symbolism in Game of Thrones is evident and perfectly readable, exactly as it was in the Middle Ages. The Lannisters have a lion, and the lion is pride and strength and royal ambition, and that is what the Lannisters have and are. Animals and their symbolic implications are more striking and easily identifiable. Now, consider Can Grande della Scala, the lord of the city of Verona, fair Verona, the patron of our Italian national poet Dante Alighieri. The coat of arms of Can Grande della Scala was a ladder, and Scala literally means ladder. The coat of arms were canting arms, just a pun on the bearer's family name. Even an illiterate person could understand them, but they would not make a very memorable coat of arms in a Game of Thrones, probably. At least not as much as a dragon. Remember, though, that Can Grande did not choose his arms, yet he had some other options to symbolically represent himself. Can Grande literally means big dog. Luckily, nobody uses that name in Italy nowadays, but that is the literal translation of his name, big dog. This is what you actually see represented as the crest of his helmet. Not only a nod to his name, but also a quite fitting image for a noble military leader. Michel Pastoureau notes that when coat of arms crystallized and stopped being a way to express the values and ambitions of their bearers, people sought new ways to do that, to do what symbols do in Game of Thrones, express individuality and the role that one wants to play in the world. Badges were one of such para-heraldic symbols. They didn't have a colored field. They could be worn not only by the person who created them, but also by his or her followers, retainers, even by soldiers, as we see in Game of Thrones. An example of this is the White Boar or the Son of York, two badges of Richard III, which also figure in Shakespeare's drama. Now the winter of our discontent is made glorious summer by this Son of York, not just a metaphor or a nod to an historical event. It was also a reference to the badge of the person. Some badges, like coat of arms, so we see they were freer, more free than coat of arms in their use. Some of them were also attached to a motto, and this evolved, especially in the Renaissance, into the impresa. I am using the Italian term. It was an artistic form that matched, coupled together, a visual component called the body and the soul, a verbal component, a sentence or a motto, in allusive ways like rebus. The impresa was used by a person or a group to either signify an intention, something that the creator or the bearer wished to achieve, or something that had been achieved. Without reaching such levels of complexity, I think Game of Thrones heraldry somehow borders also these other visual codes. There would be much more to say, but not a lot of time. As a closing remarks, we should note that we have considered heraldry in medieval times and contemporary heraldry in fantasy, in contemporary fantasy fiction. But what about fantasy heraldry in the Middle Ages? Because medieval literature and art loved to create coat of arms for people who didn't have them. Ancient Greeks, ancient Romans, people from the Bibles, or for literary characters like the Knights of the Round Table. Michel Pastoureau has compiled a survey of arms from characters of Arthurian literature for Knights of the Round Table. And even here, medieval fantasy heraldry differs from the real one. Just a couple of examples. First, once again, there is a preference for and variety of animals. We might know now why. Secondly, it is interesting to note that the color purple, that is virtually non-existent in medieval heraldry, there are only about 20 instances, was instead used in substantial percentages, at least since the 14th centuries, for the arms of many knights of the Round Table, for reasons unknown even to Michel Pastoureau. So we see that even in the Middle Ages, fantasy heraldry forced a little bit the boundaries and the rules of original heraldry. To conclude, in the Middle Ages, just as today, literary and artistic creations influenced society, the way people thought and imagined themselves and the world. I do believe heraldry has been and still is a powerful and evocative visual language. Media such as those I have tried to present here have the merit of having brought heraldry to a wider public, encouraging its study, and why not, even encouraging personal creativity. Interestingly, even when fantasy pushes the limits of historical heraldry, it seems to fall back into other heraldic or para-heraldic systems. Exploring heraldry today helps us appreciate art, identify peoples, groups, territories involved in or represented into works of art and monuments. I think that is worthwhile to approach this art with a deserved respect to its original spirit. Once we as public, learners, artists manage to appreciate this language, we will discover a world of surprisingly free expression and endless possibilities. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Francesco. That was fascinating. Really interesting to think about, again, the idea of medieval inception, fantasy heraldry, and fantasy heraldry today, now and in the Middle Ages. Fabulous. So I will go ahead and introduce our final speaker for this panel, Chris Larson, who will be talking to us about images of the alchemical laboratorium in the medievalist world of The Witcher. Chris, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. And let me share my screen. And I'm sure you will let me know if there are any issues with my slides. Okay. Like much of fantasy media, including the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and George R.R. Martin, the fictional world of Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski's Witcher novels and short stories falls under the umbrella of medievalism. Medievalism is defined by Tyson Pugh and Angela Jane Weissel as works that, quote, turn to the Middle Ages for their subject matter or inspiration, and in doing so, explicitly or implicitly, by comparison or by contrast, comment on the artist's contemporary or socio-cultural milieu. Common tropes in modern medievalist literature include the depiction of feudal kingdoms, pre-industrial technology and limited scientific knowledge, and widespread belief in superstitions. Sapkowski's universe has been adapted into a series of internationally successful computer games, a 13-episode Polish TV series, Wiedźmin, the Hexer, in 2002, and the ongoing Netflix live-action adaptation, The Witcher, and animated prequel, The Nightmare of the Wolf. The science of the monster hunter, or Witcher, Geralt's world, combines pre-Copernican science with technological aspects of the Industrial Revolution, what might be termed steampunk technology in the expanded sense of any anachronistic technology used in popular culture. For example, dangerous and unethical genetic engineering plays a central role in the Witcherverse, including the creation of the Witchers themselves through mutating normal human children. This is accomplished through a scientific magic termed mutagenic alchemy, conducted by renegade sorcerers, who are the mad scientists of Sapkowski's fictional world. The term mutagenic alchemy brings to mind that of genetic alchemy, or alchemy, coined by Nobel laureate biologist Joshua Lederberg. As described by Mary Midgley, quote, just as the alchemists took all chemical substances to be fluid stages engaged in becoming gold, and thought that they could hasten the process, so it is proposed for the modern transmutator, all life is a similar continuum along which he can move any element at his pleasure. Jeremy Rifkin explains that, quote, alchemy means to change the essence of a living being by transforming it from one state to another. More specifically, the upgrading of existing organisms and the design of wholly new ones with the intent of perfecting their performance. Indeed, this precisely describes the goal of mutagenic alchemy in the Witcherverse, not only in the creation of the Witchers, but, most regrettably, the illegal manufacture of new forms of monsters for Witchers to hunt, thereby assuring them job security. We now have the what and the how, but what about the where? In our modern world, we stereotypically expect a scientist to work in a laboratory, an ominous space containing a dizzying array of strangely colored glassware, open flame Bunsen burners, bubbling multicolored concoctions, pickled body parts in jars, and ominous sparking electrical machines. Now, these stereotypical views are largely shaped by both distant memories of high school chemistry lab and Hollywood. As noted by the TV Tropes website, the typical mad scientist lab features most of the items listed here on this slide, noting that, quote, nothing shouts science to a casual viewer more than more than a guy in a lab coat fiddling with a beaker of colored liquid. Now, the laboratory, as we commonly understand it, is a modern invention. In the mid-15th century, the Latin term laboratorium, from the root labor, referred to monastery workshops, analogous to the scriptorium, the scribe's copy room, and the dormitorium, the dormitory. By the 16th century, laboratorium referred to the workshops of alchemists, apothecaries, and metallurgists, and subsequently came to refer to all accommodation in which natural phenomenon and processes were explored by means of tools and instruments. These early labs were centered around a furnace, a design carried over into early chemistry labs in the mid-19th century. Now, the basic chemistry lab as we know it came into popularity at that time, featuring Bunsen burners and impressive collections of bottled chemicals. Now, the most iconic equipment of an alchemist's laboratory, besides the furnace, were those used for distillation. Gourd-shaped cucurbits were attached to the beak connected to an alembic, allowing the heated material to vaporize in the latter and condense into the former. Tools included bellows, crucibles, and metal spoons, scissors, hammers, tweezers, and files, which were used with melted metals, as well as various pots and vessels, often made of clay, metal, and porcelain, which were used for distillation and other manipulation of liquids. Medieval woodcuts and engravings contained curious artistic representations of alchemical labs, often highly allegorical in style, as shown here. Some depictions were satirical in nature, reflecting prejudices against alchemy. Later paintings drew upon these less than accurate depictions, leading to further artistic exaggerations. The 17th century painter David Teniers the Younger painted over 300 different representations of alchemical work, depictions that were problematic as they were based on genre paintings and still lifes rather than actual laboratories. Some of the common tropes, human or animal skull, globe, glassware containing a colored liquid, books, or arcane knowledge, are definitely noted in this representative piece. So putting together earlier depictions of alchemical labs with later representations from the 17th century, we can construct a list of medieval or alchemical lab tropes, which we will parallel against the modern ones. And hopefully you can easily spot them here in this picture. I've circled them in yellow for you. Now, regardless of the lack of fidelity of many of the visual representations of the alchemical laboratory in the Middle Ages, they represent the source material available to any conscientious Hollywood set designer. Therefore, we can ask, what would the medievalist version of these tropes look like in modern fantasy? I'm going to argue for you that it is precisely the magical/scientific laboratory that we find in Andrzej Sapkowski's medievalist world. So let's look at some examples from the series. In the 2002 Polish TV adaptation, Geralt visits the sorcerer Istred in his lab. We can easily see skulls, human and otherwise, a pile of books, rather modern-looking glassware, and an animal skeleton. Geralt is less than impressed with the array of equipment, scoffing, quote, "Every time I see this stuff, I wonder if one couldn't dabble in magic without all these eyesores." Now, Istred retorts, quote, "That deep, true magic requires knowledge and research." And he very dramatically, with a flourish, reveals that he has a woman's corpse on ice, part of his research on infertility. Now, while the available video quality of the episode is not great, as you saw in the last slide, we can still identify many alchemical and modern lab tropes, which I've done for you here. As you can see highlighted in yellow, we have an amalgam of the modern, clearly minus the electrical devices, and the medieval. It is also interesting to note that there is some natural overlap between the two lists of tropes. They carry over from the medieval to the modern. In Netflix's 2021 animated prequel, The Nightmare of the Wolf, the Witcher Vesemir enters a secret basement lab as a child, a bestiary where monsters are studied and, he later learns, are created in vats. The sorcerer, here called a mage, Riedrich, explains that in the past, some monsters were crossbred through inelegant alchemy, but now the mages, quote, guard the secrets to such mutagenic alchemy, preventing further abuse. As we learn, that's a bald-faced lie. As an adult, Vesemir rescues his friend, the elf Filavandrel, from the mutated elf Kitsu. She has been trying to recreate the illicit genetic engineering that created her in the first place. Think Frankenstein's creation trying to make his own family in his image. Kitsu's lab reflects many modern tropes, including specialized glassware that did not exist before the 1800s. Now, Vesemir is horrified to find a secret room in the bestiary where the mages are creating new monsters for the witchers to hunt, again, assuring that they will have jobs. The mages' creation of life through artificial means brings to mind the alchemical homunculus, described by works attributed to Paracelsus from the early 16th century, and included in Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Faust, Part 2. So, summarizing the depictions of laboratories in the animated Nightmare of the Wolf, we again see a synthesis of both the alchemical and modern lab tropes, which again I've highlighted for you in yellow. Season 1 of the live-action Netflix series features a single detailed laboratory belonging to the sorceress Triss Merigold. Now, while the scene is brief, and I have spared you the mangled bodies preserved in salt, we can still easily identify several of the alchemical and modern tropes, and an interesting continuity boo-boo, a literal off-the-shelf modern Florence flask with the manufacturing label clearly visible. Now, in season 2, much of the action takes place in the ruins of Kaer Morhen, the Witcher's ancestral home, which was significantly damaged at the end of Nightmare of the Wolf. The basement bestiary still exists for the sole purpose of conducting examinations on monsters. The secrets of mutagenic alchemy have been lost, and with that, the ability to make new witchers, leaving Geralt and his brethren an endangered species. Production designer Andrew Laws explains in a behind-the-scenes video that, quote, it's not just a matter of having a few pretty things on a table. We want to make it look like there's a purpose. These are autopsy tools. This is what happens in here, you know? How do they cut things? How brutal is it? This is our version of a medieval world. Now, the level of detail in this set clearly reflects Law's vision of what this medieval alchemy lab should contain, and we recognize a number of familiar tropes, including simple metal tools, animal skulls, scrolls and books, and an examining table and wall-mounted manacles, in case what you are examining gets a little too unruly. The space is introduced in episode 2, Kaer Morhen, where we see Geralt conducting a brutal autopsy on a piece of mutated monster, both the tools and the technique reflecting the brutality of the monster hunting lifestyle. In the next episode, What is Lost, Vesemir, now the elder statesman of the Witchers, is obsessively trying to figure out what killed one of his own, carefully peeling away and prying out bits of foreign monstrous tissue from the man he raised from a child. He voices frustration that even with, quote, a lab full of alchemical compounds that can change day to, expletive, night, he is unable to solve this mystery of how a leshy, a monster, could become so heavily mutated. In this bird's eye view of the lab, we again spy a number of expected items, from an operating table and a variety of crude metal tools and labware, notably relatively authentic medieval ceramics and metals rather than more modern glassware, to books, and it is presumed arcane knowledge. Now, Geralt seeks the scientific opinion of Triss Merigold as to whether the Leshy and another monster that had killed the Leshy were mutated by mutagenic alchemy. And Triss, being the good scientist, mixes some of the tissue with a liquid, utters a magical spell over it, and sets the solution to spin in a centrifuge overnight, noting that any sign of magic will cause the sample to glow in the morning. Now, this is clearly a case of steampunk technology, as the first experiments with rotating wheels on the orientation of seedlings were conducted by Thomas Knight in 1806. And the first continuous centrifuge was designed in 1876 for the purpose of separating cream from milk. Now, while Triss fails to find any sign of mutagenic alchemy, she and Vesemir do find evidence that Ciri, Geralt's foster daughter, has powerful magic within her blood, magic that can possibly be used to make more witchers. Vesemir appeals to Ciri's love for Geralt and the other witchers to submit to experimentation. This particular scene in the lab, notable for its juxtaposition of simple pots and a mortar and pestle, with a more modern rack of test tubes. Test tubes, it should be noted, are an early 19th century invention, perhaps made by famed chemist and physicist Michael Faraday. Ciri consents to being a guinea pig, and Triss draws her blood using a long, thin metal pipe, similar to a metal straw, connected to a modern appearing rubber tubing. This is somewhat accurate. The first blood transfusions were done in 1666 by Richard Lower in Oxford. As reported by Robert Boyle to the Royal Society, quills were inserted into the necks of dogs and connected with silver or brass pipes. In some cases, the pipes were directly inserted into the animal's veins or arteries. The next year, the Royal Society received a report of a transfusion from a sheep to a human using a combination of quills and very thin pipes, thinner than had originally been used on the animals. We therefore see that in this case, the prop designers of The Witcher have provided a historically reasonable facsimile of a 17th century medical instrumentation, with the exception of the rubber tubing. Now, Triss engages in alchemy of her own, carefully crafting a witcher-creating potion from Ciri's magical blood. Her equipment is a curious mixture of more medieval, mortar and pestle, with modern lab equipment that is crafted from wood rather than metal to give it an older feel. For example, a primitive-looking glass flask with a strap of leather wound around it is held in place on a wooden stand rather than with metal clamps. Such a simplification was not possible in the case of the hypodermic needle that they needed to inject the potion. The first such device, the first hypodermic needle, was probably created by Francis Rind in 1844. So instead, the prop designers went all out steampunk, creating an ominous multi-needled and artistically decorated piston-style needle that the audience would probably identify as Victorian in design, if not engineering. Now, Geralt interrupts the attempt to use the potion to turn Ciri herself into a witcher. And Geralt, the protective father figure, spirits his young ward as far away from his mad scientist colleagues as he can. As Triss and Vesemir reflect on the horrors of their experimentation, we see smoking modern flasks with a green, ominous liquid. This is a visual cue to the audience that these two mages have slipped into mad science, in case the audience isn't smart enough to figure it out on their own. So how did Andrew Law and his crew do? As seen here, the laboratory in the Kaer Morhen-based episodes hits nearly all of the alchemical and modern tropes, with the exception of electricity. We will end with a quick study of perhaps the most authentically alchemical lab in The Witcher, that of the renegade sorceress Lydia, a specialist in blood tracing. Using chemicals and magic, she ascertains the source of blood through smelling it. Although, as she notes, she usually conducts her forensic alchemistry on the dead. Instead, here she is tasked with verifying that the potion created by Triss out of Ciri's blood really was made from Ciri's blood, because the flask has been predictably stolen by one of the bad guys. Notice that her lab contains metal alembics and wooden, metal, and ceramic mixing and storage devices, mirroring those seen in alchemical woodcuts and engravings. The glassware is primitive, with the exception of test tubes. Perhaps because the set designers believed the audience would not respect Lydia as a scientist without having a test tube or two laying around. In the trifold taxonomy of medievalism crafted by David Matthews, Sapkowski's tales offer a Middle Ages, quote, as it never was, having a medieval appearance, but taking place where there cannot be a Middle Ages. Sapkowski himself not only reflects that, quote, fantasy uses a medieval veneer, but whoever said it was actually medieval, but argues that his invented world has, quote, no points of overlap with medieval reality. Similar to George Martin's saga, Sapkowski's world largely offers a vision of a Gothic or grotesque Middle Ages, entailing the assumption that anything medieval will involve violence, threat, and warped sexuality. Here is a version of medieval alchemy, which serves as a proxy for mad science, but always with a nod to modern visual cues and tropes that a modern audience expects in such Frankensteinian cautionary tales. Thank you very much for your attention.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. And let me invite all of the panel speakers back on screen for the Q&A. Welcome back. And if you haven't already, please use the Q&A function to pose questions to our speakers. And I think I will take moderators privilege and ask you guys the first question. I'm very curious to hear from all of you, because I think this was a through line of your talks, about this idea of the kind of compressing of history. So it's, Ali, to use your term, medieval-ish, but not actually accurate or sort of having any relationship with historical precedent. And I'm curious to hear from all of you, kind of what is the reason for that, or what is the effect of that on viewers, and how does that either play into audience expectations or even subvert them in some way? And how are we to interact with that idea of medieval-ish, or this kind of compression of time, as viewers of these fantasy properties?
I agree. It is kind of a thing that does seem to pop up, of this concept that the medieval is all one thing stylistically and historically, and it's just very compressed and conflating different parts with different parts. And I think it is a lot of an issue with efficiency, that it is easier to communicate this concept of a single unified medieval thing than it is to say, like, well, in the early Middle Ages, it was kind of this, in the mid-Middle Ages, it was kind of that, by the late Middle Ages, we were kind of thinking Renaissance. That it's more of that shorthand to especially in a property like Magic, where, as I mentioned, like, there's not a lot of room in the cards for storytelling, to quickly say, hey, here's the medieval, do with that what you will.
Mm-hmm. And it's so much a product, as you said, of medievalism itself. So it's creators looking at medievalist properties, and as well as some maybe actually medieval things. And Chris, in your presentation too, this idea of modern glassware, and that kind of fits with our expectation of a laboratory, even though it's not medieval per se, right?
Right. It has to be foreign enough to take you out of your everyday life and let you sort of immerse yourself in the other world, but yet not be so jarringly different that you don't believe it. And so if especially, I think it's also coding for the audience that some of these people are standing in for mad scientists. So the trope that we associate with a mad scientist, we have to at least see a nod to that somewhere, to in the back of our minds go, oh, okay, I understand that we're signifying that this person's up to no good. They could be a mad scientist, even though it's in a medieval setting.
Yeah,
to piggyback on
yeah.
what Chris said, I see a lot of the Tiffany problem, that, you know, the name Tiffany existed in the Middle Ages, but if you set a movie or a fictional property in the Middle Ages and you have a character called Tiffany, then people are going to be like, no, that's inaccurate. So I feel like it's very much that of like, well, of course it's the Middle Ages if you have weird, grotesque science things going on, and like, even if that isn't necessarily accurate.
And I think what we've received as being sort of necessary parts of the Middle Ages, I think that plays into a lot of these expectations too. Francesco, I was thinking about that with heraldry, like, and any kind of medieval inspired fantasy fiction, we expect for there to be this very elaborate system of heraldry. And like, we've all learned the Game of Thrones heraldry, right? Even though it has only partial relationship to medieval precedent. So having that sort of be something that audiences expect. And I was interested in what you said about the idea of medieval heraldry also being a fantasy in some ways for these figures that didn't have it. So I was curious about where you see the role of imagination coming in to heraldry, and why do we want to see certain parts of heraldry reflected back to us in fiction, do you think?
Well, I think it's, as I said at the beginning, it's normal that medieval fantasy include heraldry, and we can see that our fantasy heraldry reflects our stereotypes and expectations on what the Middle Ages were. Of course, nobody would like to be Lord Big Dog of the house ladder and have a common everyday object. Of course, they attributed symbolism even to the ladder, and there were different variation of the coat of arms. But as I perceived it, sometimes some artists just treat it as decoration on the shield, and a lot of art creations, different types of fictions, want heraldry just to be something for knights, and we have seen it was not like that, and something that always have to be warlike and have images of aggression. And
I mean, maybe the latter hasn't come down to us as a particularly desirable piece of heraldry. Francesco, there's a question from the audience. Was the rule about animals facing right tied to the idea of left as sinister? And are there examples of medieval or modern artists using left-facing animals to mark villainous characters?
So I do not have a satisfying answer to that. But first of all, English heraldry uses Anglo-Norman as its language to describe a coat of arms. And left is actually called sinister in heraldry, in English heraldry. So I do not know if they avoided the left because it was considered sinister, negative, but I do know that it was common occurrence, and that right, the right side, even the word right, both means the connotation of words, a direction, but also something that is right, that is correct. So yes, right was the position of honor. Unfortunately, we will see heraldry in the news because the Queen died, and we will probably see a lot of the British royal coat of arms. If you notice, the arms of England, the 3 leopards on red, are in the right side. So that is the place of honor. I also imagine that carrying a shield, you would want your lion to look towards you, and while you are carrying a banner and you are marching towards the battle, you would want your lion to walk towards the battle, not look back at your soldiers as if it wanted to run back. I checked the arms of some big villains in medieval literature. The arms of Mordred are a variation of the arms of Gawain, so no connection. Not even the arms of Satan, because the Middle Ages invented also a coat of arms for the devil. No no indication of the use of the left. Sometimes they say, but this was not a rule, once again, that the bend sinister, that is a diagonal line going from the top left to the bottom right, marked bastards, but this was not always the case, and there are a lot of families using the band sinister with no indication of being bastards.
So not as widespread as maybe we had thought. A question for Chris. Fascinated by the plethora of Teniers paintings of laboratories, do you see compositional characteristics or style in these representations, like the arrangement of figures coming into play with the recent figuration of the laboratory in The Witcher? Do you see sort of other art kind of coming into play with the way that laboratories appear in The Witcher?
Well, I think Tenier's work was so influential, and there was a whole, basically a school of pseudo Teniers who painted in his style. And that's where we get a lot of this idea. And so the alchemical trope that I was talking about is pretty much taken from the woodcuts and then the Tenier representations, putting that together. That's what I think most people would think of when they think of an alchemical laboratory. And so that together, those what we might call medieval representations, which again were highly stylized and some satirical, combined with the Teniers, that really sort of frames, I think, what people would think of what an alchemical laboratory should look like.
Right. Fascinating. So we have another question for Francesco, but I would like to kind of blow it out to apply to all of your presentations. For Francesco specifically, how would you evaluate Game of Thrones' approach to heraldry? A narrationally focused one which serves the purposes of characterization but sacrifices realism or accuracy, or a hugely simplified historical adaptation with little regard to authenticity? And I actually think that this is kind of at the heart of a lot of medievalism. And Ali, I'm wondering if you could talk about this related to books as well. This kind of tension between the representation of things in medievalist sort of properties in The Witcher, in magic, in heraldry, like in Game of Thrones, the tension between historicity and then kind of narrationally important aspects. So I'm wondering if maybe you can also all talk to this kind of, it's not necessarily diametrically opposed, but the necessity to have something that pushes a narrative forward combined with a kind of visual authenticity or sort of a visual accuracy.
I can try and be brief. I think Game of Thrones heraldry is a simplification of medieval heraldry, yet we tend to perceive medieval heraldry as being very complex. The most fundamental rules are not a lot. Yet when Game of Thrones heraldry bends the rules of heraldry for the sake of narration, it is not doing something that people in the Middle Ages did not do. They did the same, as I tried to say, they did the same in their own fictional versions of heraldry. So yes, it is simplified, but heraldry also served that narrative purposes. So it's not doing something new.
Yeah, I agree there that it's doing something different. It's not necessarily, it depends on the priorities and the goals of what the person telling the story or communicating the thing is trying to accomplish. We as educators and museum professionals and communicators want to educate about history as it actually took place to the best of our ability through actual historical objects. But that is not necessarily what game designers and writers and television directors and costume designers are wanting to do. They're wanting to get the gist of it. So it rolls back into that idea of compression and why that is so pervasive. And coming back again to that inception idea, it's now because there is such a corpus of fantasy stuff to draw upon, we're seeing a lot of new fantasy drawing upon old fantasy, which drew
Right.
upon medievalism and medieval things. So it's this interesting sort of leapfrogging happening here, which is curious. So yeah, I think it has a lot to do with priorities and goals for the depictions that people go with.
Mm-hmm. Chris, something similar is happening with The Witcher, right? Like there's a need to push the story forward at the same time as having something, a space that feels authentic enough. But when you start to dig into the details, it really reveals itself in this way, right?
Right, and especially because it's very clear that Sapkowski's world is not our world. The Sapkowski story takes place in a multiverse, and there's evidence that Ciri does travel to our Earth a couple of times during her travels, but the main action is in a different time, on a different space-time continuum. And the laws of nature are different, because I wish we could do the magic that they do scientifically in The Witcher. So you already have a different scenario, completely different universe in a sense that you're working from. So you're defining what is normal. And so there's this interesting tension where he has, this very rudimentary medieval type technology, but at the same time, they're doing genetic engineering. They're doing it through magic, but it's a scientific magic. And so they're sort of Sapkowski's rewriting the rules as he's going, which I think gives the adapters some freedom. Because in the source material, you already have sort of thrown realism out the window in certain aspects. And so, okay, if we tweak it a little bit more, there you go.
Yeah.
If you've already got spoilers, if you've already got 3 unicorns, what's a 4th unicorn, right? I mean, right? You add a little bit more magic, a little bit more here or there, whatever.
Yeah, that really resonates with the Jessica Pressman quote that I pulled in my presentation about how the fakery doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad, that it makes a new realm for creativity, and also can sort of reinforce history in a weird sort of backwards way. But yeah, the fakery enables creativity in ways that if you were trying to be really truly medieval, you couldn't be, because obviously this is a land of unicorns and magical DNA experimentation, and yeah, it's cool.
This was something that Brian and I ran up against a lot too, the idea of fact-checking fantasy series against medieval history, and the sort of futility of that in a way. Like, why do we feel the need to do that? And sort of what is the actual intersection of medieval history and accuracy with these fantasy worlds where anything should be possible, right? Like we should be able to define the rules of those worlds without necessarily being constrained by the facts of history. But I find it always so interesting when fantasy series do want to create something that feels plausibly historical, but then kind of rip that apart in other ways. There are dragons, there are zombies, but we still want to have stone castles and things like that. So Dot, you're right. The historical accuracy is not the point, but I do find this kind of medieval skin that enrobes so much of this fantasy material really fascinating. And to what extent that feels accurate or is, I think is a really fascinating question that I think we'll probably hear from a lot of people today about. If there are no other questions, do you guys have questions for each other? Any other things that you really want to bring up?
There's an interesting comment in the chat as a professional archaeological illustrator focusing on the medieval, in particular, source material. That is something that I really wanted to talk more about, but couldn't really go into in my talk for time purposes. But, the freaking, there are so many library systems to comb through if you want to search for source material. So of course people use Google. It's just, of course, that is the first place you end up. And places like Pinterest and even not to
The
call
bane
out
of my
those-
the bane of my existence is
God,
like these unattributed images on Pinterest.
yeah, and people who just upload random things to Getty Images. And like that is where the source comes from with no context. So the solution here is to give libraries bucket loads of money so that they can better promote their systems and even have like universal depositories of digital content. But you know, until that happens, in the meantime, we just have to sort of hoot and holler about resources the best we can to sort of disseminate them outside of the academic world, where it feels like, well, of course you would know the Folger Library's digital library of bookbinding references. But every digital depository is different also. So a lot of them don't go into the same detail as the Folger. They don't photograph the foredge and the spine and different angles, raking light and paper and stuff. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if the whole message of today is give the libraries a boatload of money to digitize things, make them widely available, that's a noble goal. Awesome. And yes, this comment about the discourse about Game of Thrones wanting to be historically accurate, and the fact that it's an entirely fictional setting, anything they do or do not import from the real medieval is a choice. And I think that that's something that we definitely need to keep in mind as we think about fantasy and the sort of more problematic aspects of fantasy in some ways, that history is not watching. History does not dictate the things that we create in fantasy. So I think we can set our own priorities in the year of our Lord 2022. So I want to thank all three of you for really fascinating papers, and to the audience for some great questions. We still have lots more today, so we will take a short break and then reconvene at 11:30 Pacific for a really fascinating set of lightning talks. So you'll get a lot of different stuff really fast, and looking forward to more conversation as the day goes on. So thanks to the three of you again, and we'll see everyone back here at 11:30.